as you heard from Steve, I've been helping people leave institutions actually since the mid-1970s. I've helped close institutions since the latter part of the 1980s. And I'm still helping people leave institutions to this day. Recently, I was in Washington State where they were going, we can't figure out how this person can leave because he's too challenging. And when we took a look at what was going on with him, we could see how things were challenging when he was in the institution. Because this is somebody who wants to have things organized precisely. He could be a Japanese classical decorator because he wants nothing that is not useful in his room. He wants a dresser, he wants a bed, and if you like to decorate it, he will undecorate it. And he likes to undecorate in a dramatic way. And people said, well, where's he going to live? Who's he going to live with? And I said, well, let's figure that out. But do you have plans? And they said, well, of course we have plans. He's going to live with the most challenging person in the state. He's only number 2. So I'm going, so what do these two people have in common? Extraordinarily great difficulty getting along with other people. And we're going to put them together. The outcome, as a friend of mine used to say, will be lifelong employment for psychologists. And it's not person-centered. And yet, everybody I talk to, everybody I ask, says that they are person-centered. So part of what we have to do is start with, what do we mean? What do we mean when we're saying we are person-centered and we offer person-centered services? And I think it begins with saying we listen to people and we recognize the dignity of everyone that's involved, and we seek to discover. We don't always discover, but we seek to discover and understand the unique characteristics of that person. And what we're trying to do is help people have positive control. And please pay attention to the fact that I didn't just say control. Positive control. And the outcome ought to be a life that the person defines as satisfying and fulfilling. And the outcome should also be one where they are valued and recognized for contributions. One of the things that we're not very good at is recognizing people's gifts. Figuring out what those gifts are and recognizing them, and yet other people have figured them out. I've spent a lot of time in a lot of institutions in the process of getting people out. And when I'm getting people out, I also recognize that there are people working in the institution who love the people they support. Just flat out love the people they support. And when you ask them, why do you like Charles? They will tell you Charles' gifts, his contributions, because in a relationship where we care about each other, we recognize each other's gifts. And one of the things you heard earlier is one of the curses of modern life is the potential for loneliness, the potential for separation, the potential for isolation. And one of the dangers that we're looking at is having people live lives of what might be perceived from the outside as splendid isolation, but from the inside is perceived as loneliness. But I've had people tell me I'd rather take a chance on loneliness than live with people I hate, than live with people who irritate the heck out of me, than have people boss me around. But that doesn't mean we don't have an obligation to build a web of relationships, to seek the people who appreciate the person, to be able to look for those gifts. And if we're really doing this well, it's not a one-time thing. And one of the traps that people get into is, oh, we need to write a person-centered plan for you. And we wrote it, and it's beautiful. And we will never change it. Yet you will change. What you like will change. Who you like will change. So we need to have a cycle that begins with listening and observing. And I have been planning with people for decades, and I routinely hear from people, well, what about these people? They don't communicate. And I don't know, Steve told you earlier that he has some disability labels. One of my disability labels is I'm a congenital smart aleck. It is a disability, especially when you don't have good impulse control. So if somebody comes to me and says, I work with people who don't communicate, my response is, I'm so sorry you work with people who are dead. Because the only people who are not communicating are deceased. People communicate with their behavior quite clearly. We may or may not be paying attention, we may or may not understand, but people are communicating. There's even research for people who have something called locked-in syndrome, where they don't have any voluntary muscle movement, where people are doing brain scans and they can see the brain being activated when other people are talking. So we may not know how to communicate with those people yet, but they're communicating. So we need to listen and observe, and we need to record what we've learned in a way that's usable and retrievable. It's got to both be something that we can use to help somebody move, but then have the people who are then supporting the person once they move be able to make use of it. So it can't be buried in bureaucratic jargon. It has to be written in just ordinary, simple language. And, and it has to have outcomes that make sense for the person. For years, we used to teach goals in a way where we would say, here's what's next. If you learn to button your pants, we'll teach you to put on a belt. If you learn to button your shirt, we'll teach you to put on a jacket. And I don't know, have any of you been involved with people who had shoe tying goals? And here, Velcro was invented decades ago. But we will still have goals that don't make sense for people. But we do have dreams that people have. We do have desires that people have. And somebody wants a job, they may have to learn a skill to be able to get that job. They may need to be able to learn how to take public transportation. And I used to teach people how to take public transportation when I ran the agency Steve mentioned, which was in the Washington, D.C. area, great public transportation. And we used to teach people, you will be lost. That'll happen. Here's what you do when you get lost. And I will always remember getting a phone call one day where the person on the other end said, Mr. Small, it worked, I'm lost. But she had done everything she was supposed to do. She was on her way back. But it's outcomes that make sense for the person. And it's implementing it. It's actually acting on what you've learned. It's training the staff who work with the person to be able to use the plan to interact with the person in a way that makes sense. And recognizing that it doesn't stop. When people move from one setting to another, all of the aspects of that environment change. And the things that used to irritate the heck out of me are no longer present. And behaviors that we thought really needed interventions just go away. And sometimes people just need to try stuff. When Steve was the director in Pennsylvania, I was actually helping close some of his institutions at that time. And we helped some people move out in the Pittsburgh area. And they moved into a house where they, for the first time, had control over the kitchen. And they turned to the staff and said, can we make toast? And the staff person said, well, of course you can make toast. There's the toaster, there's the bread. You can make toast. They made a whole loaf of toast. They didn't eat the toast. They just wanted to make toast. And then they said, that's kind of a waste, isn't it? And that person said, yep. Yeah. But you want to make toast? You can make toast. From that moment on, they only made toast as they wanted to eat it. But they wanted that opportunity to just have that freedom, to be able to do that little thing. So it's often not a really big thing. Sometimes it's little. And the plans that we teach always start out with, why would you want this person to be in your life? Why do you like this person? Why do you admire this person? So many of the documents that I get to review, and when I go to plan with people who are very challenging, I say, send me the records. And the records I get always start out with, John is very similar to Attila the Hun. Here's a list of the activities he's engaged in that are horrific. They don't tell me why you'd want John in your life. They don't tell you that there's staff who think that John is a very cool guy. They don't tell you about what you like and admire. And even for people who are just regular folks, it starts out with, Cheryl is a 36-year-old female with Down syndrome. Well, that sets your head. So you start thinking about Down syndrome and 36-year-old women. Instead of saying, you know, Cheryl is somebody who can light up the room with a smile, who's remarkably giving, who's never met a stranger. What do we like and admire? It's the introduction. And then what matters to the person, which we call important too. The second thing we should be reading isn't what's wrong, it isn't how to support, it's what the person wants. How does the person define a really good life? Even if we're not going to go along with it. We need to know what matters to you, even if we're not agreeing with it. Because the next piece, outcomes and goals, begin to say, well, you want that, but we can help you get this. And how does health and well-being fit in the context of how you want to live? Because think about it. How many of you follow your doctor's orders precisely? Anybody here do that? Anybody here follow? No. All of us pick and choose. Yeah. I am personally distressed because the body mass index, I'm shrinking because I'm getting old. I've lost 2 inches in height. I think the body mass index should say how tall I used to be, and that's the way we should calculate the number. In which case, I am perfect. Now, but we all rationalize our way into picking and choosing. So health and safety comes as a context. It's not the thing, it's a thing. And how do you support the person where there's a balance between them? What are the instructions for staff? What are the instructions for the people who do the services? So if you think about it this way, it's really pretty simple. Pretty straightforward. Learning how to do it and learning how to write it, a little more complicated. But the basic structure, pretty straightforward. And recognizing that a plan is never done. Because if I was to write a plan with you, and then I come back a year later, there would be things that would change. There would be things that you've taken up, things you've gotten bored with. People who you're now in a relationship with, other people who perhaps disappointed you. It's a nice ringtone. So real person-centered plans are implemented. If you're doing a real plan, you can read the plan, you can look at the person's life, and you can see that they crosswalk. And they aren't one-time efforts. We keep recording the learning as it happens, and we keep changing things. And how and where we support the person changes with the learning. Does that all make sense? So, what about those people who aren't going to make decisions on their own? Who need support to make the decisions? Well, there's something that in legal theory in the US is called substituted judgment. I don't know how it translates, but what it means is that I have an obligation to spend enough time to figure out what decision you would make were you competent. And unless there's a health or safety reason to not support it, I have an obligation to support it. There's also something called supported decision making, where I can help you participate in decision making however you can, so that you are part of the decision making process and the two go together. Because my goal when I'm doing supported decision making is to go, what decision would you make? And unless there's a good reason, I'll go with it. And if there's a good reason not to go with it, how close can I come? What can I do that's close? So, if we're really doing person-centered work, we're helping people make active choices, informed choices, just 5 simple choices. Who supports me? Where do I live? Who do I live with? What do I do with my time? And what do I do with my resources? And except for that very first decision, it's one that all of you make. You all decide where you're going to live, who you're going to live with. And if you have found that where you live is intolerable, who you live with is no longer acceptable, you make changes. But there are trade-offs. Because where you live may be because your family's there, not just because you want to live there. Maybe who you live with means there's some trade-offs because you don't get to pick family. But you're still making active choices. You're still making active decisions about it. Now, are any of you still on your first job, by the way? When we think about what people do with their time and we talk about jobs, we act as if they're going to get one job one time. Most of you, if you were still in your first job, would need medication. It wouldn't be satisfying. You learn from doing. How is it different for the people that we work with? So we're trying to help people make informed choices. But we need to recognize that this is a real paradigm shift. It's going from a system where we say, oh, honey, we know what's best for you, to something where we're asking, what do you think is best for you? We're going from a system where we have clear power over to power with. And choice seems simple, because it seems like we should just be able to say, well, everybody has preferences, likes, and dislikes. Everybody, knows what they want to have present or absent in their life. So just ask them. And help them get it. If it were that simple, you wouldn't be asking somebody from America to come and talk to you. Because questions about how you want to live really require reflection. If I was to ask any one of you, how do you want to live 5 years from now? And I was just to walk right up to you and say, so tell me, how do you want to live 5 years from now? I got a form. And I did it cold. Yeah, you'd be going, oh, wait a minute. Give me some time. And give me some structure to reflect, to explore. And we also need to recognize that an awful lot of the people that we're working with have not tried enough stuff to really know what they want. One of the questions that was asked earlier is, well, what about people who are going to day services and they say, I like it, I'm happy. Well, if it's the only thing you know, how do we know that there isn't something better? And when we talk about loneliness, some of the research is starting to demonstrate that if you want a friend, get a job. That employment is where many of us acquire our own friendship networks. Getting a job then can become part of how we get connections. But will you know whether you want a job or not unless you try it? And some jobs will fit better than others for different people. So we need to be able to ask it. And if you communicate differently, we need to listen differently. I've not only done a lot of plans with people who don't communicate with words, but I've also done a lot of plans with people who have psychiatric issues. I worked with the psychiatric system in Minnesota and Michigan, and we've taught people how to write their own plans. We've written plans with people, and how people are behaving is often what you have to listen to if you're going to help them stay stable. If you're going to understand when they're going to go into crisis. If you're going to understand that what they say and what they mean may be different. And so we have to be able to listen differently. And we really have to recognize that an awful lot of people who use disability services have experienced trauma. And trauma impacts on choice. Trauma impacts dramatically on choice. I was working with a woman in Washington, D.C., and staff was telling me she's entertaining a different man every night. Isn't that choice? And I had a small explosion and said, no, it's a symptom. When you see that kind of behavior, you're looking at somebody who's almost certainly experienced trauma. Don't treat it as a choice. Treat it as a symptom. And get the treatment and support this lady needs. And the fact that she can't tell you in a very direct way doesn't mean it's not there. So, and there's some people who want to do stuff where any sensible person would be going, no. So if I want to go for a walk, but I don't pay any attention to street safety, and I want to go for a walk by myself, we're going to come to a compromise. We're going to figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. For one guy who wanted to go for walks by himself, on his schedule, it's actually how he regulated his emotions, how he regulated how he felt. What worked was to help him move. He moved from a city to rural. He moved from a place where walking by himself was dangerous to where walking by himself was quite safe. He's somebody who has a label of autism. Once he figured out a path to take, he took the same path every day. It was his, so we weren't worried about where he was. I was sitting actually with the staff who was working with him and supporting him, and he got up and the staff person said, "Hey, Bill, it's cold, get your coat." He stopped, grabbed his coat, he was gone. And I said, "Aren't you worried?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, when's he going to be back?" He said, 17 minutes. Looked at his watch, sure enough. So sometimes it presents a risk, but often we can figure it out. But keep in mind that informed choice assumes that you know what you want. And a lot of the folks that we're working with haven't had the life experiences. They haven't had the opportunity for reflection and exploration to figure it out. You also, when you're thinking about choice yourself, you're also thinking about what's possible. So you may have a dream about the penthouse in Jerusalem overlooking the old city. Or maybe it's Tel Aviv overlooking the beach. But for most of you, it would have to be one of those lottery tickets. And you know it's possible. And part of what's possible is what's desirable. And it's also, you know the trade-offs. You're making a conscious decision. And you have to recognize that this means choice has boundaries. One of the traps people get into is, oh, person-centered means you get whatever you want. Well, choice has boundaries for every person in this room. We just heard some of the streets are going to be closed because there's a race. Well, you could drive on them anyway. There might be a consequence. So there are laws, there's statutes, there's expectations of behavior which produce boundaries. And if somebody isn't really aware of the boundaries or somebody's at risk, then we figure out how to help them not do it. So if somebody's going to cross the street without looking, we're there. And we're not just saying, oh, it's your choice. Just go ahead. And there's also your values. There are people you will not spend time with willingly. Unfortunately, some of them may be related to you. But there are people that you will not spend time with willingly for whatever reason, for whatever your values are. And they're people who you look forward to spending time with because your values align with them. And your choice about one thing affects your choices about other things. So where you work, where your job is, impacts on where you live. You may be, a lot of people in the States, I don't know if it's true here, who are parents of young children, choose where they live based on the quality of the nearby school. And they may be saying it's not the choice where I live for myself, but it's the choice where I want to live for my kids. Ripple effects. And we all have limits around money. John Augusta is going to talk to you about the limits that come with government money, what we've been learned. But all of you have limitations on your own choices. Have any of you noticed that you haven't entered the most high-pay profession that there is? No. So we all make choices, we all make trade-offs, and you all decide yourselves what risk is okay for you. So how many of you would jump out of a perfectly good airplane, skydive? How many of you would go skydiving? Hardly a hand in the room. Mm-hmm. How many of you would go swimming with sharks? Did training in California where this woman said every year, love to go swimming with sharks. I was thinking, that is not on my bucket list. But you decide what makes up risk for you. Have any of you tried downhill skiing? Anybody here tried downhill skiing? Any of you discover it was a terrible idea? No? So again, you discover what is risk for you and what is thrill for you. The difference between you and the people we support is we get involved in that conversation. We get involved in whether that's an okay risk or not. And I worked with a guy who had significant cerebral palsy and wanted to go bungee jumping. And I'm going, this could end very badly. And he said, but I really want to go. And we found a company that would put together a harness for him so the parts of his body that were going to get stressed weren't going to get hurt. So we figured out a way for him to actually have that risk, but a way that accommodated who he was and what he does. And the quality of choice versus the quantity of choice. Do we have any vegetarians in the room? Yes. So what if I took you to a butcher shop and said, I believe in choice, you can have any piece of meat in here you want? No. Even though there's quite a few. You know, we could find the gourmet butcher shop that has 247 cuts of kosher meat, and no. And I haven't been to a supermarket here, but are your supermarkets like the US supermarkets where you have a whole aisle of cereal? Have you ever watched? Nobody shops the entire aisle. It's overwhelming choice. It's too many choices. There's actually research. People have studied this. And people actually come in and focus. They go, I'm going to stick to the granola section, unless I have young children, in which case I will also stop at the chocolate section. So quality and quantity matter. And one of the things that you're looking at as a government, one of the things you're looking at as individuals who are hoping for services to be present, is some of what people are going to want doesn't currently exist. So you're going to have to develop it. You're going to have to figure out how you can do it and how you can do it at a cost that you can afford. But the fact that it's not paid for at the moment doesn't mean it couldn't be paid for. Doesn't mean we couldn't figure out how to do it. And who can make a choice? Anybody. But it takes skill. So I would not send any of you, if you haven't been trained, to go develop a plan with somebody who doesn't communicate with words. But I would tell you that there are skills that are easy enough to teach. We know how to teach them. I've got a whole not-for-profit devoted to teaching people how to listen to people. We have hundreds of people who've been trained in it, who are good at listening, good at describing. Absolutely a teachable skill. And part of what we've learned is that we need a common language. And we need something that works for everyone. Because when somebody says it's person-centered, it should work for humans. If it's person-centered, it should work for all of us, not just disability. If it only works for people with autism, it only works for people with bipolar disorder, or it only works with people with CP, then it's clinical. It's not that it's not important. It's still very important. We still need expertise. But if it's person-centered, it should work for humans. And we should be able to say, how's it going to look? So these are too small. The text is too small for those of you 3 rows back to read. This is not an eye exam. I will not ask you to cover your left eye, read the 3rd line. But I'll tell you what they are, just very briefly. Liam's mom wrote this. Liam lives in South Dakota with his mom and dad. And Liam was going to the doctor. And for Liam to go to the doctor, even though he is a very cool, silly, happy, socially brave, eager to learn, a good hugger, he's also deaf and blind. And going to the doctor is not necessarily an easy thing for him. So this is something that Mom wrote to send to the doctor. One of the questions that you heard earlier today is, what do you do with parents who are oppositional? Teach them to write plans. I've had a whole bunch of parents who were oppositional, who once I said, here, let me show you how to develop the plan with your son or daughter. Let me show you how to separate important 2 from important 4. Let me show you how to develop a good description. They became powerful advocates for that plan, which typically involved the person moving. So we taught Liam's mom. Actually, somebody I taught somebody else who taught Liam's mom. So you can make this a chain that spreads. And Elizabeth Kate wrote this with her dad in Texas. Elizabeth Kate was graduating from high school, and so we needed a plan, and the Texas standard state plan is pretty bad, but we also made it a table of contents. So this says pages 6 to 10, pages 4 to 5. And again, what do we like and admire? A gutsy gal, true blue friend, lights up a room, a fashionista. And when you look at what's important to her, ordinary stuff, being independent, living independently, a thriving social life. At this moment in her life, she's shopping for a boyfriend. 2 plans later, I have the whole sequence, She is interested in boyfriend management. So pretty ordinary, typical. But she also has to have a machine that helps her breathe, called the CPAP. Otherwise, she gets really severe sleep apnea. And she has trouble controlling her emotions. She calls it a fireball when she gets really angry. So how to avoid that. So all of that is embedded in the plan. Tammy, I showed people yesterday who were here. Tammy is somebody where people say, well, what about people with significant disabilities, with complex medical needs? Well, part of what's important to Tammy is to not sit on her tubes, because she's in a wheelchair that has tubes. Part of what's important for her is to be suctioned. But part of what's important to her is to look good, have clothes that match, be part of what's going on. And then any one of us could wind up in a hospital. And Sophia here was involved in a horrendous car crash. University professor involved in a car crash, head-on collision on a big highway, over 120 miles an hour collective collision. And the trauma doctor said, I've never seen anybody that severely injured who lived. She spent, we call her the amazing titanium woman now. She has all kinds of plates and screws, all of her ribs separated from her sternum. She spent weeks and weeks in rehab. And this was posted for the nurses. And it says things like, avoid scary hospital hair. So again, it works for any of us. And it works for end of life. This is Sam. Sam fought in Vietnam. And Sam got post-traumatic stress syndrome from his experiences in Vietnam. And he was a great dad, but he also treated his PTSD with alcohol. And he wound up with stage 4 esophageal cancer. And this was done right at the end of life, where for him, quality of life was being able to watch the hummingbirds, and he still wanted the taste of beer. So daughter figured out how to make Budweiser slushies, so he could still have that taste. And he still wanted to be able to tell jokes. And if any of you go to Louisiana and you like off-color jokes, ask for Pierre and Boudreau jokes. None of them are clean. But he would be happy to tell you. And because of this, he, instead of getting 24/7 care, he got 2 hours a day, except on chemo days. And the end of life was great for him. The woman in blue was sitting with him, listening to him tell a story when he passed. So it works for humans. In fact, it even works for old guys who are the chair of an NGO and want the other people on the board to know how to work with him. And it's something that we do routinely. You know, the people who fund services in the US, they're called the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. We are currently scheduling developing these so that they can work together better and understand how all of this works. So these are ways of doing, but it's more than just planning. Because if all you do is plan well, you will wind up with better paper, not better lives. There has to be a commitment not only to plan, but to implement. And you have to be able to figure out where the balance is between them. Where's the balance between important 2 and important 4? And you have to be able to learn all the skills that go with it. And those are part of what we teach so that people can do good plans. And how do you keep plans alive? And how does that work? And how do you make sure that people who are working with each other are a good match? How do we make all of that work? And some of it is very simple. How many of you are the spring from the bed cheerful people? How many of you are spring from the bed cheerful people? None of you? This is a country of grumpy morning people? Huh? How many of you will not talk until you've had caffeine? No. So what if we made the spring from the bed cheerful people staff for the I won't talk to you till I've had caffeine? And somebody comes bounding into your bedroom and says, today's the first day of the rest of your life. You would be going, today's the last day of yours. Being able to figure out what works for people, how to have a good match. So we talk about what's important to, what's important for, and what's important to people includes things like status and control, as well as relationships, things to have, rhythm and pace of life. There's a lot of little things that go into what matters to us. It's not just where we live, who we live with, but how our day works, who we spend time with. The people understand how we like to have things happen. And important for is health and safety, but it's also being valued, being a valued member of your community. And it is about balance. I asked you if any of you follow your doctor's orders, but you know, we routinely tell people they should do something because it's good for them. Well, there's research. Well, I'm going to ask, how many ex-smokers do we have here? How many former smokers? How many of you quit smoking just because you read the pack and it says it's bad for you? I haven't met anybody who did that. Everybody knew it was bad for them when they started. And when you ask people why did they quit, some people will say health. But you know what the most common reason for quitting is? Children is one. Take a look at this. Cigarette sales in the US, strongly correlated with price. Want people to quit smoking? Raise the price. Not about health and safety, it's about I don't have the money. Time. So one last slide. Where people live matters. And some settings can be toxic. Some are tolerated. Some are supportive, some are healing. And clearly running over, so let me quickly end. As you start looking at people moving, you want to make sure the setting they're moving into is a supportive or healing setting. And people who have challenging behaviors, Nancy talked about this earlier, often 70–80% of challenging behaviors that we see are a nonverbal critique of the services that people are receiving. It's a toxic setting. People who appear to be mildly depressed frequently are in a tolerated setting. Supportive setting means that we know what's important to you, we know what's important for you, and it's largely present. In a healing setting, somebody who's experienced trauma, somebody who has a psychiatric disorder, the setting supports healing. And we've seen this happen with people all over. Sarah held the frequency of hospitalization records in her state, psychiatric hospitalizations. And when we started paying attention to what mattered to Sarah, hospitalizations went way down. She still has a significant psychiatric disorder, so they didn't totally go away, but they went to being weekly to being semi-annual. So that's a really quick overview. And Nancy, is there time for questions?
Absolutely. How about a question?
Can you say a few more words about planning with someone who doesn't speak?
So if I'm planning with somebody who doesn't communicate with words, then the first thing I do is say who's in their life. So I actually make a list of who's in their life. And then I sit down with each person in their life and say, how do you spend time with them? So I know. But then I go, what do you like about Nancy? What do you admire about Nancy? And when's the last time you had fun together? Those three questions will sort who I should listen to. Because only people who have a personal connection are people who are going to be able to really share what's important too. And I've told people in advance that's the purpose of those questions, and people still can't figure it out. I asked that question in San Diego of a woman who was running a group home and about Tony, and she said, oh, he's no trouble in the bath. She had no personal connection. Talked to the person in the day service, and Tony was a cross between, did you all seen Seinfeld, the TV show? You know Kramer? Yeah. Tony makes an entrance like Kramer. Doesn't communicate with words, but he's about 6'4". And I talked, and he also, you all read Winnie the Pooh? So if you took Kramer and Tigger and put them together, you would get Tony. An amazing guy. And you had to discover people who appreciated him that way. Other questions? Yes.
Can you make several plans with several people, or is it too much? Or, I mean, it sounds like every person that matters can have a plan with this person.
You have one plan with each person.
Yeah, but can you have several at the same time with each person?
So is it people having input into the plan?
No, like I have one plan with my sister, I have one plan with my doctor. Or, I mean,
so yes, if you see, if you're a mom, and I know a number of moms who do this, where they have one plan for their son for the teacher, one plan for the person who drives him to school, one plan for the doctor. Liam, who I showed you, that was the plan for the doctor. They've got a separate plan for school. I have a video actually of Sandy, his mom, describing how to do that. Typically, system people don't have the resources to do that many plans, so it's usually moms and dads.
But isn't it too much?
Is it working too? No, most of the stuff is the same. Because the person is the person is the person is the person. It's how do you respond in this setting? So for Liam, how he identifies you is by feel. So you want him to feel your, so he would look, you would have like, I have a very thin ring. He would look for that. If you have a piece like your watch, it's got open links on it, you would let him feel that. That would identify, So that's true everywhere. That's how he identifies people. But bits of it would be different.
One more question.
אני רוצה בבקשה לשאול או לקבל עצה. כשאנחנו באים עם המגמה לשירות מוכוון אדם ויציאה לדיור עצמאי, אנחנו פוגשים משפחה. ואנחנו מציעים את התוכנית ואת הבחירה. ואדם אומר, אני מרוצה איפה שאני נמצא, וההורים שלו אומרים, אנחנו מרוצים איפה שאני נמצא, ושירותים החברתיים במדינה מביאים את הדעה שלהם שהכל בסדר. איך אנחנו מביאים את ה... וכבר אמרת שאחד הדברים זה שאף פעם לא הוצאו חלופות לבחירה, אלא זה מה שהאדם מורגל אליהם. מה אנחנו עושים בסיטואציה כזו שכדי... ואם יש לנו בכלל זכות לערער על הטוב לנו בסיטואציה הזאת, כדי לקדם את הערכים המשמעותיים של התוכניות שלנו. זאת השאלה שלי.
So, we don't have a right to uproot you if you're making an informed choice. But are you making an informed choice? We have an obligation to explore. So the first thing I would do would be to say, let's really spend some time with you and your parents looking at what's important to and separating it from important for. Because one of the things that parents have typically done is had important for, being what's paid attention to, and important to got buried. And then sitting down and saying, are there things that you'd be willing to try? Are there things that you'd be willing to experience, which would take you the next step? In some cases, though, we are uprooting people because I've worked in places where we're closing this place where you live. this institution. We're closing it. We're going to help you find a life that we think you'll like better. And we had a couple of guys in an institution that I helped close who didn't communicate with words, whose parents said they were very happy, and they did appear to be very happy. We took them on a tour of apartments and townhouses for them to live. They walked into one townhouse, and when we tried to get them out, they wrapped themselves around the railing. And we're going, we've got to get a lease before you can move in. But so we also don't know what we don't know.
Unfortunately, we're going to end there, so let's thank Michael.